The snow was already up to his knees when they found the cage. Inside, what looked like a dead dog. Frozen fur, eyes half open, breath barely there. The tag read, Max, Nevada PD. But Nevada was 800 miles away, and his handler was already buried. Raymond Hale, 55, ex-Marine medic, stood staring through the bars. His hands shook, not from the cold. He whispered, "Easy, soldier." The dog didn't bite. He just stopped shaking, like he remembered that voice. They said Max had gone feral after the ambush. They said no one could touch him. They said mercy was wasted on something that dangerous. But Raymond had heard that tone before. The silence after a man gives up. Once he'd been the one behind the cage. Now, in the middle of a Montana snowstorm, a broken soldier was about to meet the only soul who still believed in him. And what they'd uncover in that blizzard would rewrite everything about what mercy truly means. Before we begin, take a breath. Tell me where you're watching from, because tonight, wherever you are, you'll want to know how far a man and a dog will go to bring each other home. The snow fell the way memories return, slow, endless, without mercy. It blanketed the ridge above Silver Hollow, turning every tree into a ghost, every sound into a whisper swallowed by white. Wind crawled through the valley like breath through broken glass, carrying the scent of pine resin and something older, something like loneliness. Inside a weather-beaten cabin, half buried in drifts, a dim lamp burned against the dark. Raymond Hale sat beside it, hunched over the guts of an old carburetor, his fingers moving by habit more than hope. The light carved the hard lines of his face, 55 years, each one leaving its mark like a scar. His hair had gone to gray and uneven streaks, and his eyes, pale blue once, had dimmed to the color of smoke. When the wind pressed against the cabin walls, he'd look up, listening, as though expecting a voice that never came. The radio on his workbench crackled. He kept it on out of stubbornness, the way some men keep a cross in their pocket even when they've stopped praying. Static hummed, steady and aimless. Then a voice cut through, a man's, sharp, metallic, almost lost under the interference. K9 unit down, handler deceased, evac impossible, coordinates lost. Then silence. A hollow kind of silence, the kind that doesn't end when the transmission does. Raymond froze, his wrench halfway turned. The wind outside wailed against the eaves. He turned up the volume, but the voice was gone. Just static again, endless and uncaring. He sat back, staring at the old dial, his breath visible in the cold light. The cabin seemed smaller then, its corners darker, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to listen. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the stove, feeding it scraps of wood and memory, listening for anything, an echo, another signal, some sign that whoever had spoken was still alive. But dawn came gray and heavy, and the only thing that moved outside was the snow. By mid-morning, a truck crawled up the ridge road. Its tires crunched over the frozen path, headlights dull behind the falling white. Sheriff's Deputy Tom Kearns stepped out, a man in his 40s with a red beard and eyes tired from long winters. His coat was dusted in frost, his breath rising like smoke. In the truck bed, under a canvas tarp, something stirred. "Found him down by the old quarry," Kearns said quietly, barely breathing. Raymond followed his gaze. Under the tarp lay a German shepherd, coated in ice and blood. One paw was torn, the pads cracked open and dark. The fur along his back was matted with snow, his body rigid from the cold. His collar hung twisted, the tag scorched but legible. Max, Nevada PD. Kearns shook his head. No one knows how he got this far north. We were going to put him down. He's gone wild, they said. But the vet's out of town till Friday. Figured you had room in that old shed of yours. Raymond said nothing. He stepped closer to the tarp, the cold air burning his lungs. The dog's chest rose faintly. One eye opened, amber, clouded, but alive. And in that gaze was something he knew too well. Refusal. The will to survive after the world had already stopped caring whether you did. Easy, boy, Kearns murmured, setting the cage down on the porch. Don't get too close. He bit the last one. The cage door clanged shut behind the deputy's retreating boots. Raymond crouched beside it, his knees stiff, his breath clouding the air between them. Max's growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Low, feral, warning. His teeth flashed once in the lamplight. Raymond didn't flinch. He saw the tremor in the dog's flank, the shallow pull of his ribs, the twitch of a paw that no longer obeyed. You're not angry, he murmured, more to himself than to the animal. You're afraid. The words vanished into the cold. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled, sending light across the floor. He fetched an old blanket and a bowl of water, set them near the cage without a word. The dog's eyes followed him, wary but unblinking. Raymond took off his gloves. His hands were thick, scarred from burns and shrapnel, hands that had once stopped bleeding, once tried to hold on to life long enough for it to matter. The night deepened, pressing against the windows. The only sound was the wind and the slow drip of melting frost from the eaves. Raymond sat on the floorboards, his back to the wall, facing the cage. The fire's glow flickered over his face, the lines around his mouth deepening each time the wood popped. He thought of that voice on the radio. K9 unit down. He'd heard too many words like that before. Brief, clinical, stripped of grief so it could fit inside a transmission. But something about it stuck beneath his ribs, like shrapnel that never healed. He reached for the lantern, adjusting the wick. Shadows crawled across the room. The dog stirred, muzzle lifting slightly. Raymond met his gaze again. Two survivors staring at the same silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, soft as snow falling on tin. Easy, soldier. The growl stopped. Just like that. The dog's ears flicked, nostrils flaring, head tilting almost imperceptibly. A thread of steam rose from the bowl between them. For a moment, neither moved. The storm outside eased, the wind screamed, dimming into a sigh. Raymond held still, hand extended through the cage bars. The heat from the stove barely reached that far. He didn't breathe. Max's nose twitched, his eyes searching that scarred hand as though chasing a ghost of memory. Then, slowly, the dog shifted forward, one step, then another. His breath hitched. He sniffed the hand. The air between them trembled, thin as glass. Raymond closed his eyes. For the first time in years, something in him unclenched. Just slightly. Just enough to remember he was still human. Outside, the snow began again, soft and relentless, covering the footprints on the porch until it looked as though no one had ever been there at all. The ridge had gone silent after the storm, leaving the air heavy with the weight of snow and unspoken things. Inside the cabin, Raymond moved through the stillness like a man unsure whether he'd woken from a dream or stepped deeper into one. Max lay near the door, his body stiff but his eyes open, tracking every flicker of light that touched the threshold. For 3 days, he barely touched the food Raymond left out. His ribs pressed against his skin like the frame of a broken ship, and whenever the wind rose and moaned through the cracks, he would lift his head, whine softly, and stare at the world beyond the wooden door, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Raymond didn't try to stop him. He understood that kind of waiting, the kind that sits behind your ribs and becomes a part of your breathing. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of wind, carried a faint echo of something he couldn't name but felt too deeply to ignore. Sometimes he'd catch himself reaching for words, the way a man once used to pray but had long forgotten the language. The stove burned weakly, and the clock on the wall had stopped ticking days ago, though he hadn't wound it down himself. Time had become snow, falling, silent, without measure. The sheriff had told him it was a bad idea keeping the dog. "He's dangerous," the man had said, boots crunching on the porch. "That animal doesn't know you. He only knows loss." Raymond hadn't answered. He just looked at Max, saw the tremor in the dog's shoulders, and realized the sheriff was wrong. It wasn't danger that lived inside the shepherd's eyes. It was recognition. Two creatures standing at the same edge, afraid of what waited on the other side. At night, the cabin turned into a hollow drum. Raymond would sit near the window, the radio silent now, its dial forever frozen in static. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moon, smooth and untouched, like a world that had decided to start over without him. Max sometimes walked in circles, restless, then settled by the door again, paws twitching in dreams that seemed more vivid than the waking world. And when he whimpered in his sleep, Raymond would whisper into the quiet, "Easy now," not knowing whether the words were meant for the dog or himself. But the silence never lasted long enough. In it, ghosts found their way back. They came in fragments, the smell of diesel, the metallic taste of dust, the scream of a radio before the explosion. Afghanistan, a desert that burned through years and names. He could still see the convoy stretched along the narrow road, headlights cutting through the dark, and then light, too bright, too sudden. The sound of metal twisting, bones shattering, the impossible weight of another man's blood on his hands. Raymond had carried that night for a decade, folded neatly into a corner of his mind where no one could touch it. Saving no one had become his shield. If he didn't try again, he couldn't fail again. Now the smell of iron returned, not from war, but from the frozen wound on the shepherd's paw. Raymond cleaned it with trembling hands, wrapping the leg with old gauze he found in a drawer. Max didn't resist. He just stared, breathing slow, eyes half closed as if remembering the same kind of pain. When Raymond finished, the dog lowered his head and let out a low sigh that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't defiance either. Outside, the mountain wind gathered again. It started as a whisper, then built into a roar that pressed against the windows and made the lamp tremble on its hook. The ridge was calling in the language of storms. Max rose before Raymond did, pacing the floorboards, ears sharp, tail low. Something in the air had shifted. Raymond watched him for a long moment before reaching for his coat. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Let's see what's got your attention." The door opened with effort, the cold biting at their faces. Snow whirled sideways, stinging the eyes. Max leapt forward, nose to the ground, his movements guided by instinct older than fear. Raymond followed, his boots sinking deep, the wind stealing his breath in bursts. They crossed the clearing behind the cabin, climbed the ridge where the trees bent under their white burden. Max stopped near an old spruce, pawing at something half buried beneath the ice. At first, Raymond thought it was nothing, just another piece of frozen earth. but then the edge of metal caught the faint glint of the lantern he carried. He knelt, brushed the snow aside with his gloved hand, and felt the familiar shape beneath his fingers. It was a tag, cold, scratched, almost erased by weather. He turned it over and read the inscription. L'Unforgettable a Marin. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Even the storm seemed to pause. He felt his pulse echo in his fingertips. That name had been part of the radio transmission, spoken just before the line went dead. He could still hear it, the clipped urgency, the sound of a man dying and refusing to surrender. And now, that man's tag was here. Miles from the nearest base, miles from any place a human should have reached alive. Raymond's breath clouded the metal. He whispered the name once more, the syllables brittle in the cold. How did it end up here? He looked down at Max, who had begun circling the tree again, nose to the ground, body tense, tail straight. The dog's breathing quickened, short bursts of frost against the dark air. Then, without hesitation, he started digging. Snow scattered like dust in sunlight. Max's paws tore at the ground with a kind of desperation that wasn't random. It was memory. Raymond watched in silence, his lantern shaking slightly in the wind, light throwing restless shadows across the snow. The deeper Max dug, the louder the storm seemed to grow, as if the ridge itself wanted to drown the sound. Then came the thud, metal against earth. Raymond stepped closer. Half buried beneath the roots was a crate, its edges blackened by fire, its hinges rusted and warped. He brushed away the remaining snow, revealing the faint outline of military markings burned into its surface. The paint had peeled, but he could still make out the stenciled letters, blurred and old. His hand hovered above it, unwilling to touch, unwilling to know. Max stood beside him, chest rising and falling fast, ears flattened against the wind. The dog let out a short bark, not alarm, but insistence. Raymond stared at the crate, then at the tag still in his glove, its surface catching the reflection of the lantern's flame. L'Unforgettable a Marin, he whispered again, though it sounded more like a prayer this time. The storm howled overhead, swallowing the name before it could fade. He knelt in the snow beside the wreckage, his breath heavy, his eyes reflecting the trembling light. Max pressed close, silent now, gaze fixed on the crate as though guarding it from the darkness itself. Somewhere far above them, thunder rolled, muted beneath the weight of the storm. And in that frozen stillness, man and dog, scar and shadow. The mountain seemed to remember what it had buried. The crate groaned as Raymond pried it open, the hinges surrendering with a tired sigh that cut through the night air. The smell that rose from inside was faintly metallic, like rust and old smoke mixed with the ghost of diesel. Inside lay the remains of something once purposeful, shredded maps, corners curled and edges burned, a camera with its lens shattered like a frozen eye, and at the bottom, wrapped tightly in yellowing plastic, a small data card. Its edges were scratched, its surface clouded, but it was intact. Raymond turned it in his hand, the light from his lantern catching the faded blue label. The world around him seemed to lean closer, as if the ridge itself was holding its breath. He carried the card back to the cabin, the storm pressing at his back. Max followed close, head low, tail slicing through the snow in steady rhythm. When they reached the door, Raymond paused, glancing once over his shoulder. The mountain had vanished into the storm, just a blank, white void where sky and ground bled together. He shut the door against the wind, the latch echoing through the small room like a heartbeat. The fire was almost out, He fed it a handful of wood, then set the camera and the card on the table beside his old radio, both objects looking strangely fragile beneath the flickering light. He tried the camera first. The button stuck. The screen blinked weakly and then died, refusing to remember. He found a cable in his drawer, plugged it into the radio's auxiliary port, a mechanic's improvisation born from years of making dead things work again. Static hummed through the speaker, a rhythm that almost sounded like breath. Then the radio screen flickered once, a distorted glow in the dark. A few files appeared, corrupted, all but one. Raymond clicked it open. The image stuttered, gray, broken pixels swimming through static. The sound was worse. Fragments of wind, gunfire, a human voice lost between channels. Then, for a single heartbeat, the picture steadied. He saw a convoy moving through blinding snow, shapes of trucks, men shouting against the storm. Then gunfire. The camera jerked. The screen turned white, then dark again. But one frame survived. Just one. A silhouette dragging another shape through the snow. A man and a dog. Raymond leaned closer, squinting through the distortion. The ridge behind them. He knew that ridge. The same line of trees, the same slope that curved toward the old mining road. It wasn't just any place. It was here. His breath hitched. He whispered, almost to himself, "This isn't over, is it?" Max lifted his head at the sound. His ears pricked, tail still. Then he barked once, sharp, urgent, almost commanding. The sound jolted through the small room like a signal being received after years of silence. Raymond turned to him, saw the dog pacing near the door, muscles tensing, eyes bright and alive in the firelight. He wanted to go out there again. Something in him still knew where to look. Raymond rubbed a hand over his face. He reached for the radio, trying the frequency again, dialing slowly through the static. No response. The storm outside had swallowed everything: signal, light, sound, even hope. He tried again, tapping the dial like an old habit, but the machine just hissed. A hum of nothingness filled the cabin, matching the pulse in his ears. He stood, walked to the window. Snow lashed sideways against the glass. Beyond it, the world had turned white and endless, like a blank sheet daring him to start again. He thought of the footage, the ridge, the man, the dog, and how every ghost in his life seemed to find its way back through storms. For the first time in years, the quiet no longer felt like safety. It felt like a warning. By midnight, the wind had grown teeth. It clawed through the cabin's cracks, howling against the roof, rattling the loose tin like a creature trying to get in. The fire dimmed to coals, and Raymond sat by it with Max lying close beside him. The dog's fur was damp from melted snow, his eyes half shut but alert, ears twitching at every shift in the wind. Raymond's hand rested lightly on the shepherd's back. It was the first time he'd touched him without hesitation. Outside, the forest moaned beneath the storm. Then, something else. A rhythm that didn't belong to wind or trees. Low, distant, mechanical. Raymond's head lifted. He strained to listen. At first, it was nothing more than a rumor of sound. Then it grew clearer. A faint hum, followed by the crunch of tires over frozen ground. Headlights, moving slow through the trees. He turned off the lantern, plunging the cabin into half-darkness. The faint glow from the coals painted the walls in soft orange, shadows crawling like nervous thoughts. He moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see. Through the snow, faint beams of light flickered between trunks, weaving closer. They weren't the searchlights of a rescue team. too deliberate, too cautious. Max's head rose, ears rigid. He growled, low, deep, the sound vibrating against the floor. Raymond placed a hand on his collar, feeling the tremor beneath. "Easy," he whispered, but the word had no strength left in it. Outside, the lights stopped moving. Then one of them blinked twice like a signal. Another answered from farther up the trail. 3 flashes, then silence. Raymond's breath fogged against the window pane. Whoever they weren't lost. They were looking for something, or someone. His gaze drifted to the table, to the data card still lying under the weak glow of the dying fire. The crunch of footsteps began, a slow, deliberate rhythm, boots pressing through snow toward the porch. The handle of the door quivered slightly as wind pushed against it. Max's growl deepened, rumbling through the small space like thunder trapped in a box. Raymond reached for the old rifle propped against the wall. His fingers brushed the cold metal. Outside, a truck door slammed. Sharp, final, echoing through the storm like a verdict. Then came silence again. Only the sound of breathing, his, the dog's, the mountains. Footsteps moved closer, one after another, steady and sure, until they stopped just beyond the door. Raymond didn't move. Max's eyes burned in the dark, twin embers ready to ignite. Somewhere beyond the wooden wall, someone exhaled, slow and calm, as if they already knew who was waiting inside. The wind screamed once more, and the cabin trembled under its weight. The first sound was not the wind, but the creak of boots on the porch. Then a knock, slow, deliberate, almost polite. Raymond didn't answer. He stood behind the door, breath held, the rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. Max stood beside him, body rigid, a low growl vibrating through the air like a warning sent through the bones of the cabin. Outside, a man's voice called out, muffled by snow. "We're here for what doesn't belong to you." The handle turned once. Metal clicked. The door burst inward. 3 men, dressed in black winter gear, faces half hidden by goggles and scarves. Not rescuers, not law. Raymond saw the insignia stitched on one man's shoulder, a faded emblem he hadn't seen since Afghanistan. A private security unit disbanded years ago. He'd known their type. Men who followed money, not orders, and once, long ago, they had followed him, until the day they left him to die. The cabin erupted in chaos. Max lunged before Raymond could raise the rifle, his body a streak of motion and fury. Teeth flashed. A man screamed. Another swung a flashlight, striking the side of the shepherd's jaw. The light shattered against the wall, plunging the room into wild shadow. Raymond moved without thought, muscle memory from a life he'd sworn he buried. He drove his shoulder into one man's ribs, twisting the rifle around to parry a blow. Wood splintered. The table toppled. Someone shouted, "The card! Get the damn card!" Raymond's elbow caught the nearest one across the face. The crack of bone was drowned beneath the sound of wind crashing through the open door. Max snarled, his jaws locking onto a sleeve, dragging a man to the floor. For a moment, it was war again, the kind fought in close quarters, where breathing and fighting became the same thing. Then the shot came. A flash, a sound that split the night. Raymond ducked. The bullet tore through the window behind him. Glass rained over the floor like frozen rain. Max barked, a single sharp burst that made the men hesitate. That same bark Raymond had heard the night before, urgent and commanding. It gave him the half-second he needed. He kicked the door open wider, shoving one attacker into the blizzard. The man stumbled, fell into the drift. Another followed, bleeding from the temple. Tires spun outside. a vehicle waiting. "Go!" someone shouted. They retreated into the storm, dragging their wounded and leaving a trail of red across the snow. The truck roared to life, headlights cutting through the dark before vanishing into the white. Then, silence. Only the echo of his heartbeat remained. Raymond stood in the doorway, chest heaving, snow clinging to his hair. Max limped to his side, blood streaked along his fur, panting but unbroken. The world had gone still again, but the air carried the ghost of violence, the smell of gunpowder, of cold iron, of something unfinished. He closed the door, braced it with a chair. The fire had died, the smoke curling like gray thread toward the ceiling. Max lay beside the wall, licking the wound on his leg. Raymond crouched and ran a hand over the dog's head. The fur was warm under his palm, trembling slightly. "They'll be back," he murmured. The words weren't fear. They were fact. He cleaned his hands in the basin, blood and melted snow swirling down like two rivers meeting. Then he packed a small pack, bare essentials, water, rations, a flare, and the data card, sealed in its plastic sleeve. He slipped it inside his coat, near his chest, where the cold couldn't reach it. Outside, dawn crept slow and pale across the ridge, light bending weakly through the clouds. He opened the door again. Snow swept in like a tide. Max stood, limping slightly but ready. Raymond strapped his gloves, pulled his hood low, and stepped into the storm. The cabin disappeared behind them almost instantly, swallowed whole by the blizzard. There was no path, only wind and instinct. Max led, nose to the ground, tail straight, moving with a purpose older than fear. The ridge stretched before them, white and endless. Hours passed. The world shrank to the sound of their breathing and the hiss of snow against their coats. Raymond followed the faint outline of trees, the shapes of rocks he remembered from the video. Each landmark, another piece of a map no one else could see. His legs ached, lungs burning with every inhale of frost. But Max didn't stop. He kept his head low, sniffing, adjusting, always forward. By afternoon, they reached the edge of a clearing. The wind dropped suddenly, replaced by a hollow quiet that felt too still to be natural. The snow here was uneven, mounds and ridges, unnatural formations where something once burned. Raymond's boots crunched over metal shards half buried in ice. He crouched, brushed the snow away, and felt the curve of an airframe. The marking was faint, but he recognized it immediately. A military drone. The wreckage spread across the clearing like a frozen scar. Twisted metal, burnt wiring, fragments of equipment scattered across the white. He moved closer, Max trailing behind him, sniffing the ground with slow, deliberate steps. At the center of the wreck, the cockpit lay split open, its interior blackened by fire. And there, half fused to the seat, frozen beneath a thin veil of ice, was a man. Lieutenant A. Marin. His body sat upright, hands stiff around the remains of a flare gun. Frost had formed along his eyelashes, his face calm, as though the moment had simply stopped mid-breath. Raymond's throat tightened. He stepped closer, brushing away snow from the uniform. The tag around Marin's neck matched the one in his pocket. He knelt, removing his glove despite the cold. His fingers trembled as he took the tag and placed it in the soldier's hand, closing the frozen fingers around it. For a long moment, he just stayed there. Two men from the same war, one long gone, one still, wandering through it. "Rest easy, soldier," he whispered. His breath fogged the air between them. "He made it home." The words hung there, fragile as glass, before fading into the wind. Max stood a few feet away, watching, tail low, ears flicking at the sound of distant thunder. Raymond rose slowly, his knees stiff, his eyes still on the fallen man. Then he heard it, a sound low and deep, rolling through the mountains. The ground beneath him shifted, soft as breath, then heavier. Snow began to slide from the ridge above, trickling at first, then rushing faster. The world seemed to exhale. A distant rumble spread across the valley, the sound of snow breaking free, alive, unstoppable. Raymond turned, eyes locking with Max's for a single heartbeat. The avalanche was coming. The mountain broke open, with a sound like the sky tearing in half. The ridge split, groaning under the weight of moving snow, the air filling with the thunder of collapse. Raymond didn't think. He just ran, boots punching through the white, pulling Max by the harness as the avalanche roared above them. The storm had turned to a living thing now, furious and hungry, swallowing trees, rocks, and breath. Snow poured down in waves, heavy and deafening, chasing them like a wall of ghosts come to reclaim what the world had tried to forget. They stumbled downhill, half running, half falling. Raymond's lungs burned, his vision smeared with white. Max struggled against the pull of his arm, his paws sliding, claws scraping for grip. "Come on!" Raymond shouted into the wind, though his voice was lost before it reached the dog's ears. Ahead, a black mouth opened in the hillside. An old mining shaft, abandoned decades ago, its wooden frame collapsing into rot. It was death to stay in the open and madness to go inside. But madness had kept him alive before. He dove first, dragging Max with him. The world went dark. Snow slammed against the entrance, sealing them in with the sound of stone and ice collapsing over itself. Then, silence. Absolute. No wind, no light. Just the ragged pulse of two survivors and the weight of a mountain above their heads. Raymond lay on his back for a long moment, chest heaving. The air was thin, laced with dust and old metal. Max's body pressed against his side, warm and trembling. He reached into his pack, fingers brushing the cold cylinder of a flare. When he struck it, red light flared into being, fierce and fragile, painting the walls in blood-colored glow. The tunnel stretched before them, rough and narrow, ribs of old timber jutting like bones. The walls were slick with ice, the floor littered with debris. Max sniffed the air, ears flicking, tail stiff. The sound of dripping water echoed deep inside, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Raymond held the flare higher, and that's when he saw them. The outlines of crates, stacked neatly against the stone, each stamped with faded military insignia. He moved closer, brushing the dust from one lid. Beneath the grime, the stenciled words emerged faintly. "Property of U.S. Defense, do not remove." The lids were sealed tight, edges reinforced with metal bands. He pried one open with his knife. Inside, under layers of canvas, gleamed the dull reflection of weapon parts, rifles, ammo boxes, and long-sealed rations. These weren't relics. They were reserves, hidden, forgotten, protected. He stepped back, realization settling cold in his stomach. So this is what they were guarding, he murmured. The men who'd come for the footage weren't after ghosts. They were after silence, the kind that buries secrets deep enough to be called history. Max shifted beside him, muscles tensed, eyes fixed on the darkness deeper in the tunnel. His tail twitched once, warning. Raymond lifted the flare higher. The red light caught the shape of a radio, an old field unit, dusty but intact, its cable running along the wall. He knelt, wiped the grime away, and turned the dial. Static answered first, soft and endless. Then, a voice. "Raymond Hale." The words came faint, distorted, crawling through the speaker like something half dead. "You're not supposed to be alive." Raymond froze. He knew that voice. Even after all these years, he could hear the authority in it, the arrogance wrapped in calm, the same tone that once ordered him to stay behind when the convoy was ambushed. The same man whose command had left him buried under desert sand while the others flew home. His old superior, now reborn as something colder, sharper, the leader of the mercenaries who'd come to finish what they'd started. He leaned closer to the radio, voice low. "You left me there." Static hissed back, then laughter, quiet, hollow, cutting. "We left a lot of things there, Hale. You just weren't smart enough to stay dead." Raymond turned off the unit. The silence after felt heavier than the storm outside. He looked down at Max, who sat poised and still, head tilted, eyes locked on his. The flare light flickered over the shepherd's scarred fur, glinting in the gold of his eyes. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched him, steady and calm, as if waiting for a signal only the two of them could hear. Raymond's hand brushed the rifle slung over his shoulder. The years between now and the desert fell away. His breath slowed, his pulse evened. He felt the weight of purpose slide back into place like an old weapon reloaded. "Then let's remind them," he whispered, voice barely audible, "why we're still here." The words seemed to ripple through the air. Max's ears twitched. The dog stood, silent, tail low, ready. Outside, the mountain groaned again, wind forcing its way through cracks in the sealed entrance. The flare sputtered, its light pulsing against the crates, the weapons, the ghosts. Then, a sound. Faint, distant, but real. A footstep, then another, echoing down the tunnel. Raymond raised the flare, its dying glow stretching thin along the rock. Shadows moved, 3 of them, faint silhouettes advancing through the smoke and red haze. Voices whispered between them, indistinct, mechanical. A glint of metal, a reflection of an eye. Max let out a growl, low, vibrating, enough to make the air tremble. Raymond's fingers tightened around the rifle. The flare sputtered again, throwing one last bright pulse of light across the walls. For a split second, he saw their faces, the same men from the cabin, their goggles glinting red. A gunshot cracked, deafening in the tunnel. Sparks flew. The flare dropped to the ground, spinning, rolling. Its red light faded across the stone like blood spreading through water. The storm outside roared, answering, the echo with its own howl. And in that collapsing glow, before the dark claimed everything, Max lunged, straight into the black, a flash of fur and muscle and sound, before silence swallowed it whole. When morning arrived, it came quietly, without thunder, without wind, as though the world itself had grown tired of its own fury. The ridge lay broken and half buried, a pale scar beneath the returning light. For hours, no one dared climb it. The rescuers waited until the clouds began to thin, until the mountains stopped groaning. Then, through the mist, they saw it. A collapsed shaft mouth, half sealed by ice, half breathing out the faintest trace of warmth. And beside it, 2 shapes. 1 man, 1 dog. They were still, covered in frost, their outlines soft, indistinguishable from the snow except for the rise and fall of a chest. A slow and stubborn rhythm that refused to stop. The rescuers shouted for stretchers, their voices trembling, not from the cold, but from disbelief. By the time they pulled the man free, the sun had climbed above the ridge, casting its first weak light in days. It fell across his face and the dog's muzzle alike, turning frost to glitter, pain to memory. Days later, the town's small church opened its doors, and silence filled it more completely than any hymn could. Snow lined the windowsills, melting into the scent of pine and old wood. The pews were half full. Locals, deputies, a few miners who'd once shared a drink with the man they now called the quiet mechanic from the ridge. They came not for answers, but because something in them recognized what had been carried down that mountain. The proof that mercy could still survive in a world like this. At the front, the sheriff stood in his uniform, hat pressed against his chest. His hands shook slightly as he held two dog tags, one belonging to Lieutenant Marin, the other newly engraved. The clink of metal sounded almost reverent as he placed the first tag on the memorial wall, joining the others who'd gone before. Then, beside it, he hung the second. It bore a single name, not for rank, not for title, but for faith, renewed, reclaimed, and finally, at rest. Max sat near the altar, the polished floor reflecting the dim glow of candles around him. His fur had regained its sheen, though the scar along his paw remained. He did not move. He simply watched, head tilted, eyes fixed on the man seated in the front pew, silent, wrapped in a borrowed coat, hands clasped loosely in his lap. Each time the wind brushed the church windows, Max's ears twitched, but his gaze never wavered. When the ceremony ended, no one spoke for a long time. People rose slowly, stepping outside into the cold where the snow had begun to fall again, light and gentle this time. The air smelled clean, as if the world had been forgiven overnight. Inside, the old organ hummed softly under a hesitant touch, a melody without words, like a memory being let go. That evening, the man sat alone in his cabin, its roof newly mended, fire burning low. The journal lay open on the table, pages yellowed by time and weather. The pen in his hand hesitated above the paper, as if afraid of the finality that writing brings. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows, gentle and persistent, asking to be remembered. He wrote one line, just one. He wasn't mine to save. But saving him saved me. He closed the book, exhaling into the quiet. The world felt lighter now, though nothing had truly changed. The mountains were still endless, the nights still long. Yet there was something in the silence, a softness that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was peace, or maybe it was mercy, finally finding its way back. Outside, the snow began to fall thicker, blanketing the ridge in white once more. The wind no longer howled, it breathed. Max lifted his head from the rug, ears perked, eyes bright as he watched his companion rise. The man reached for his coat, his steps slow but steady. He opened the door to the pale morning, the light washing over both of them. They walked together beyond the porch, into the open field where the horizon blurred into mist. Their shadows stretched across the snow, one tall, one low, moving in quiet rhythm. No words, no orders, no ghosts left to chase. Just the sound of boots and paws pressing into the earth. Two sets of prints trailing behind them until they began to fade with the falling snow. And somewhere, carried on that wind that had once brought ruin, came a voice softer than prayer. Almost like the mountain itself had remembered how to speak. Mercy isn't weakness. It's remembering who we were before the world forgot us. The snow kept falling, slow and patient, until everything, the footprints, the sorrow, the war, was folded gently beneath its weight. And in that white silence, the man smiled. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger, softly, like the echo of boots on snow, or the breath of a loyal heart that never learned how to give up. There are men who fight wars no one sees, and dogs who carry faith longer than any flag can wave. Together they remind us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act of staying, of waiting, of choosing kindness when the world has forgotten how. Mercy isn't a word they teach in training. It's what remains when everything else has been taken away, when a man looks at what's left and decides it's still worth saving. Somewhere out there, beneath the same sky, others like them are still walking, side by side, unseen, uncelebrated. They won't ask for thanks. They'll just keep watching over the rest of us, steady as the falling snow. And maybe that's enough. Because in the end, the world is held together not by power or noise, but by the quiet hearts who never stop believing that even in the coldest places, warmth can return.